and tonight he's going to be talking about the evolution of color, the development of color, one of the most fascinating topics in ornithology. So over to you, Derek.
So the talk that I'm giving today is called Color as Made, Seen, and Evolved in Birds. You may notice that I changed the word order a little bit, but it's made, seen, and evolved. And Etienne asked me earlier on how I came up with this as a topic to speak to, and my interest in all things to do with evolution and ecology, and how ecology is a driving force for evolution, and all of those things come into play here. And I was looking at birds and looking at what kinds of variations would be interesting to learn more about and to speak to. And so one day I thought, this would make an interesting topic. And so I started reading the scientific literature. I think I have read about close on 100 papers on this topic now since I started putting this talk together. And it's quite fascinating. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at color first, and then we'll get into the actual three subsections of the topic. But first, a little bit about me, in case you don't know me and why I'm talking about birds. I think Etienne has already given away some of my secrets, but I spent quite a number of years as a professor specializing in marine biology. I spent a number of years in university management, focusing on technology and e-learning and libraries and that kind of thing. And of late, I've spent about a decade now in technology, in the various technology startups, including the latest one of which I'm a co-founder. In my biology days, I worked on systematics and phylogeny and ecology. So these are terms that may sound familiar to you, and they were very dear to my work that I was doing. Eventually, though, I moved from biology into university management, and eventually into payment technologies, and I kind of left my biology behind. And what was my hobby when I was a biologist became my job. And so I had to bring biology back as a hobby, and I got into birding. And I became very interested in how I could use my biology knowledge to help make birding more interesting through spreading the knowledge of biological concepts in the broader birding community. And that was one of the reasons why Etienne and I established Learn the Birds, however many years ago that was now. So let's come back to color. Color is obviously very important in our lives as humans. We use it to present all kinds of information and for advertising. And if you take away the color, the world becomes a very different place, and it becomes much less interesting and much more mundane. And the interesting thing is that in a world without color, much as we understand that there is a lot of patterns among the relatively monochrome LBJ type birds, there is a lot less information contained in the world when the world doesn't have color. Color is able to add a number of dimensions of information to the world. And so if we look at birds, color is obviously something that is very important to them, because a lot of birds have fairly bright and fairly obvious colors and patterns. And so it makes one think, how do these birds make these colors? What is the purpose of colors? What do they do? How do the birds see color? Do they see it the same as we do, or do they see it differently? And what are the selection pressures that drive color differences in birds, both within a species and between species? Now, having said that, This was this morning on the way back from Kruger National Park, and you can see that this little Koran is not colorful, but it does contain an awful lot of information in the patterns of a relatively small number of colors. So, you know, it's not only bright colors, red, blue, green, that can convey information. Many birds also have, you know, considerable ability to carry information in a simple number of colors. And that includes differences between sexes, difference between individuals of different species, different closely related species, and so on. So there is a lot of information in the simple colors, but the existence of a palette gives us an opportunity to have a world that has richer information, and the world of birds is also rich in information. So let's look at what color is first, because I think one can't really easily speak to the notions that we're talking about without understanding what color is. And then we will look at how the birds make color, which is pretty straightforward if we look at it at a simple level. And then how do birds see color, because perhaps it's not exactly the way we think it might be. And then what are the selection pressures driving color in birds? And we'll look at two areas that we'll talk about will be signaling and hiding. So what is color, first of all? You know, this is just the high school physics review, but basically color is the visual perception of a part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the electromagnetic spectrum, of course, runs from radio waves, the very long wavelength electromagnetic radiation, down to gamma rays. And obviously the energy levels run from lower at radio waves up to extremely high for gamma rays. And the wavelength is the reverse of that. Gamma rays have very short wavelengths, and radio waves longer wavelengths. And these little icons here will give you a sense of the size of the different areas, the wavelength of the different areas that we're talking about in the electromagnetic spectrum. And you'll see that the radio waves are on the order of the size of city blocks and buildings, microwaves between butterflies and people in terms of the wavelength. Infrared radiation about the size of a needle, and visible radiation about the size of microscopic organisms like paramecium. Ultraviolet about the size of a molecule. X-rays about the size of an atom, and gamma rays smaller than the components that make up a nucleus of an atom. So that's the broad range that we're talking about. Visible light is an arbitrary component of that electromagnetic spectrum that is defined simply by the fact that it is what we humans have evolved to be able to see, and most other animals as well that have eyes. But the notion of color, it's not something that exists in the physical world. It's our brain's interpretation of the different wavelengths in that region of the electromagnetic spectrum that we call visible light. So color is an interpretation of a physical phenomenon, basically. Right. Hopefully that gives us a little bit of an idea of what color is. What has color in birds? I think it's obvious. The feathers do, the skin does, the eyes do, and the beaks do, and of course the eggs. Not the eggs of this bird, by the way. So those are the things that have color. I'm going to focus primarily on the feathers, and just to keep it a little bit simpler. So we'll start off with how do birds make color? And there are two ways that birds make color, and most birders probably already know this, but we'll delve into it in a little bit more detail, and it will hopefully help us to understand some of the other concepts that we come to later. One is by producing pigments, and the other is by creating structures that interfere with the light in various ways and create color that way. So we'll start with talking about pigments, which is basically the chemistry of how light interacts with the molecules that we call pigments. So pigments is a chemical method of producing color. So pigment-based coloration is in a number of forms. There's melanins, which I think we all know. It's the same pigment that humans have in their skins that give us the light, give us the light or dark tone to our skins, and in hair as well. And carotenoids, which you will find in quite a few birds, pistacofulvins, which you find in parrots, porphyrins, which are in turacos and a number of other groups, and sphenicins, which are in penguins. So those are the primary pigments that make up the chemical colors that birds have. So melanins are basically tiny granules of color that exist in both the skin and feathers of birds and other animals as well. They typically produce colors ranging from dark black to reddish brown and pale yellows. And what color they produce depends on where they're located and how concentrated they are. And it's interesting that melanins also add strength and wear resistance to feathers. So often you'll find that birds have black wings or black wingtips that give strength to the feathers that receive the most stress during flight, and that helps preserve the feathers. Now, you might think that melanins limit the range of colors that you can produce, and for sure it does. But if you think of domestic chickens, pretty much every color that you've ever seen in a domestic chicken comes from variations in the melanin pigments in the feathers. And if you think that you can't do much with melanins, this is the great Argus pheasant, and you can see all this amazing and beautiful patterns and tones in the feathers that it uses for displaying in an attempt to attract the female. That's all produced by melanins. Carotenoids. A lot of birds make use of carotenoids to create their color in their feathers. But the birds themselves don't produce carotenoids. The carotenoids are produced by plants, and they're not manufactured by the birds. They're acquired by either eating plant material that contains carotenoids or by eating prey that is itself eaten plant material that contains carotenoids. And it's a relatively simple chemical step to produce red coloration that you find in the bills and feathers of birds by converting the yellow carotenoids that are typically in the organisms that they eat, which is beta-carotene, to red ketocarotenoids like canthaxanthin, which are what gives a lot of the red birds their red color. And this is a enzymatic transition that happens after the bird has eaten the food, and it's a relatively simple change. You take the molecule, the carotene molecule, add a double bonded oxygen or an aldehyde group to both ends of the molecule, and you go from having a yellow pigment to having a red pigment. And it's interesting that this synthesis of red carotenoids probably evolved, and I always throw in the evolutionary interpretation of things, probably evolved as part of the pigmentation of the oil droplets in the retina. And then later on, the genetics of doing that got co-opted and redirected to produce red feathers. And this happens quite often in evolution, where something evolves for one purpose. And once it exists, natural selection is able to act on it and and co-opt it for a completely different purpose. Right, I think I've said that already. Oops, did I? Yes. Carotenoids can obviously interact with melanins and produce colors, other colors as well, such as olive green and grayish yellow and various other things that you see in birds. And I'm sure you've seen this variation of tones that show where carotenoids and melanins interact. Obviously, carotenoids play an important role in the coloring of birds like the flamingo. I was fortunate many years ago to have the opportunity to cultivate or culture in a test tube some of the unicellular algae that were being fed on by the small organisms that these birds filter out of the water, and show that when they're stressed by nutrients, lack of nutrients, they produce a lot of carotenoids and become almost a yellowish orange, even to red in color. And so if you think about where flamingos live, they live in places that dry and get hydrated, get concentrated of salt. So the algae that live there are stressed a lot. And once they become stressed, they start producing carotenoids. And of course, the little shrimp-like creatures that are in that water that consume those algae then pass that on to the flamingos that in turn eat them. And that's how the flamingos end up with these beautiful colors, which of course they've created out of enzymatic conversion of that yellow carotenoid. Now, carotenoids also play a role in the immune system, and they have antioxidant properties. So this is something to keep in mind later on when we're talking about honest signaling. Right. Another group that is interesting are the pistacopholvins, which are typically found in members of the parrot family. And they produce yellow, orange, and red colors just like carotenoids do. But unlike carotenoids, the parrots actually synthesize the pistacopholvins themselves. They don't come from food, but you will see that there is an aldehyde group involved in creating some of these colors, including the red color. And the interesting thing about red pistacopholvins in parrots is that they create a resistance to bacterial degradation of the feathers. Now, with birds, there's a lot of bacteria that get in the feathers and that degrade the feathers. Why wouldn't they, right? Because it's organic material, and bacteria break down organic material. That's what they do. And so having pistacopholvins helps with resistance to this bacterial degradation. And it may indeed be another case of something that was initially evolved as a result of a selection pressure from feather damage caused by bacteria that later got co-opted and used to create these color patterns that you find in parrots. Porphyrins, another interesting group that are produced by modifying amino acids, including copper atoms in them. And they fluoresce bright red when they're exposed to an ultraviolet light, which I've never, interestingly, captured a turako, for example, and put it in ultraviolet light to see what happens. But I have a turako feather here, and maybe I have some turako feathers here, if you can see them. And I should maybe do that and see what happens. There's a different chemical structure for each porphyrin, so I'm not going to go into the details of those. And basically, they are responsible for the brilliant greens and reds of turako. So I don't know if you can see the red on the end of the feather. Of course, it depends on whether you're looking through the feather or looking at it, whether you see it or not. And they produce a range of colors, including pink, brown, red, green. And Terracin is the red, and Turco Verdant is the green that you find typically in Turacos. Some owls, pigeons, and some of the Gallinaceae also have porphyrins. And this is purple-crested Turaco that comes every day to drink from the bird bath outside my office window. And it has these porphyrins that create this red and green color. And you'll see around the eye there is a little bit of the other kind of color that we're talking about as well, and also on the tail. We'll come back to that later. And then there's a really interesting one. This group of pigments was only discovered relatively recently, like 10 years ago. And it's called sphenescence, and it comes from, not surprisingly, the penguins, Sphenicidae. And basically, it's a bright orange pigment. So any of those penguins that you see that have yellow to orange on them, it's sphenescence that create that color. It's unique to penguins. It's synthesized by penguins. It's not dietary. And yeah, it's found in a variety of penguins. So you can see that there has been a fair degree of convergent evolution around the colors yellow, orange, and red. So with the Pistacopulvans in the parrot family, with the carotenoids in most passeriforms and several other groups of birds, and with senescence in the penguins, all producing more or less a similar kind of effect. Right. So let's go now to structural coloration. And this is about manipulating the physics of how light interacts with the properties of materials. So it's not a chemical reaction per se. It is actually a physical reaction that relates to the properties of material structure. And there are basically two kinds of structural coloration. There's iridescent structural coloration and non-iridescent structural coloration. If we look at iridescent structural coloration, such as in this, it's a greater blue-eared glossy starling here, you can see that the sheen on the feathers. I think everybody that's ever gone birding has seen some bird with iridescent structural coloration. And this is created by refraction of incident light that's caused by microscopic structures in the barbules of the feather. That's the individual little pieces of the feather. And depending on the view, on the angle of the view, you will see a different color. And this is refraction that works very similarly to what's happening with a prism that splits light into rich component colors. And it involves a keratin cortex and a series of keratin layers. And within some of these layers, you find melanosomes, which contain the melanin pigment. And this can act as a darkening filter, which selectively darkens the light that you see coming out, depending on the angle that you view it on. And what's interesting about the existence of these melanosomes is we've all seen iridescent birds that on some days look completely black. Why is that? And that is because the light is not necessarily coming from a particular direction. It is coming from all around because it's cloudy. And so the light that you see is mostly absorbed by the melanosomes, and you actually don't see anything being reflected. That's why iridescent birds often look black. So yeah, here's one of my favorite birds, the green wood hoopoe. This was in Satara campsite in Kruger. This bird was nesting in a hole in the tree, and you can see that it popped its head out into the sun, and you can see how iridescent those feathers are. And you can also see that if you look at the top of this circle here, you can see what's green, where the bird is looking out of the hole, becomes a different color there because it's now in a different angle of light. And if you look at the feathers immediately after that, the ones that are purple, they are almost blue in where the bird is sticking out of the hole. So this gives you a sense of the impact of the angle of light and the angle at which you're viewing it has on the color that you see. And as I said, you know, birds, a lot of birds that we see as black, in fact, have a degree of iridescence in their feathers. And this is a common scimitar bill. It normally looks quite black because we often see them in the forest or under a tree, cloudy weather or whatever. But the minute it is out in the right light, the color actually changes significantly and it looks radically different. Then you have non-iridescent structural colors. You have the same keratin cortex, and you have the same melanosomes, but in between the two, you have a spongy air-filled layer that's basically it manipulates the light. So what you get back out is always at the same angle, more or less. It's not 100% perfect, but it's more or less. And then you have the basal melanosome layer that absorbs all the remaining colors so that what you see coming out is blue and is always blue. And these tiny air pockets produce this effect by scattering the light. And if you look at blue birds, nearly all birds that have a blue color create that blue color in this way. There's not many blue pigments in the natural world. Most blue is created like this. And it's interesting that if you look at the blue feathers from the front, yes, they look blue. But if you actually, and that's of course from the scattering of the light that's falling on the feather, but if you look at them from when they're lit from behind, they often look brown. Why is that? That's because the melanin pigment is showing through and the scattering of the light is not happening because the light's coming straight from behind the feather. And so you see the melanin pigments and not the blue color of the scattering effect. So yeah, and when you see it looking brown, it's because the light's no longer being reflected back from your viewing angle, and the brown shows up because of the melanin in the feathers. And you sometimes see this effect. I've seen it quite a few times when a bird flies past a bright, like it flies in front of the sun, or it flies past a bright area of the sky. You often can see these feathers looking brown or yellowish brown or dark when the bird flies past the light. But immediately once it's passed, the feathers turn blue again, which is really odd. So yeah, most blue birds produce the color that way. And of course, all of these methods of producing color can interact with one another, and they can be present in the same bird. It's not that you have a bird, one species producing iridescent structural color and another one producing carotenoids and another one melanins, etc. All of these are able to be deployed in the same species of bird. So in our example of the starling, you can see that there's high concentrations of melanin in the feathers around the ear coverts and in front of the eye. There's melanin interacting with the iridescent pigments back in this area here, and so the way in which you see the bird is a combination of the effects of the pigments and the effects of the structural coloration. And here's another good example of the orange-breasted sunbird, which is presumably, I haven't tasted this, but I imagine that the orange on the orange part of the breast is carotenoid based, and the rest of from the breast up to the head is iridescent structural coloration. You see the same thing on the bird that the hummingbird that I photographed in Brazil, and I have no idea what the species is now because I've lost my notes on that. But you get the same patterns. Then you get strange interactions like you get in budgies, where the green plumage coloration is a result of color mixing rather than a single cause. So the green is a result of the structural colors that there's a structure inside the feather that results in reflecting both green and blue wavelengths of light, and then a yellow pigment that absorbs some of the blue, allowing the color to be green, but a different green from the light that was refracted and passed back out. So, and depending on the level of the yellow and the kind of the kind of structures that exist in the feather, you get different variations in that green color, and that's how budgies end up with these different colors. And here's an example of one of our very common bee eaters, the white-fronted bee eater. We're quite busy in Kruger when I was there on the weekend, and you can see that on the forehead and chin, there's no pigment or little pigment. So the natural plain white color of the feathers shows through. There's melanin. I keep calling it melanin. I don't know why. I think this is Trump has twisted my way of saying words. There's melanin pigment around the eye. You will see non-iridescent structural coloration probably around the vent and lower belly. You'll see iridescent on the wings. You'll see a mixture of carotenoids and melanins on the breast, and you'll see strong carotenoid that has been converted to the red color on the throat. And so you have all of these different ways of making color in the same bird. Now, birds also have feathers that reflect ultraviolet light. And many species have this, and birds can see ultraviolet light. We're going to see that in a minute. So feathers can look very different to birds than how they look to us. So we're going to come back to this idea, but I wanted to throw it out here while we're looking at colors and feather coloration. And eggs, I'm not going to dwell on this, but there's a couple of bioproteins that are primarily used in the formation of egg colors. I want to go on and quickly talk about how do birds see color. So remember that color is basically our brain's interpretation of that arbitrary segment of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes can see. And how do vertebrates such as ourselves see color? Well, we have a range of colors that we can see. So for us, for humans, it's from the near infrared all the way up to the near ultraviolet, but we don't see into infrared and we don't see into ultraviolet. And again, these are just arbitrary names that we've given to the segments of the electromagnetic spectrum that are adjacent to the colors that we can see, to the ones that we can see. So we typically have structures in our eyes that can see red, green, and blue. And so a simplified look at this would be we see red, green, and blue in some combination of a mixture of things, and this gives us what we call trichromatic vision. Trichromatic because we see in three colors. The reality is not quite exactly like that, but it's an approximation. So Now, birds see all the way into the ultraviolet, quite far into the ultraviolet, actually. And so they have another way of uh, seeing that is beyond what we can see, and so they see tetrachromatically because they have 4 colors. Now, if we look at what happens in terms of trichromatic vision, we see primarily red, green, and blue, and we make the other colors in various combinations of those. So let's imagine that we have a nice bird to look at, like this red-headed weaver, which we saw actually nesting today, despite the fact that they only have a tiny little bit of red in their bodies. In their feathers, they mostly still in their non-breeding plumage, but they were bringing material to the nest and doing all the nesting displays and everything. But what would it look like if we only could see in 2 of those 3 color bands? It would look something like that, right? Which is a very different looking bird from that one. Now, try to use that to imagine what it's like to go from seeing 3 colors to seeing 4 colors. What happens when you can see in ultraviolet? How does that interaction between the different colors happen, and what does it actually mean? How do you see it? I can't illustrate it here because there isn't anything that we can do that would illustrate what ultraviolet looks like, because we can't see it. But it might look something like this. So the bird might look like that in ultraviolet, for example. It would definitely not look the same, for sure. But we don't have any ideas about that because color is how our brain interprets things. And we have no idea what a bird's brain interprets, and we have no mechanism to understand that. But we do know that ultraviolet plays an important role. So if you look at the blue tit, when I spent a few months in the UK, we had a pair of blue tits nesting outside the apartment window. And the male and the female, to my eye, looks absolutely exactly the same. You could not see any difference between them at all. But if you actually look at and measure the reflectivity in ultraviolet, now this is not how the bird would see it. This is just to give an indication that there are feathers in the crown of the female blue tit that shine brightly in ultraviolet. How the bird sees it is anybody's guess. But clearly, ultraviolet plays a role in sexual dimorphism in birds like the blue tit and possibly other birds as well. So, when I go out birding, I often wear my camouflage, and I have a camouflage hat on, and I have a camouflaged lens coat on my lens, and I'm trying to sneak up on the bird, thinking the bird can't see me. But I don't know what the bird sees. I don't know what my clothes are reflecting in the ultraviolet. Maybe the bird sees me like this. Who knows? But what we do know is that if you wash your clothes in and dry it in a dryer with various fabric softeners, that increases considerably the ultraviolet reflectance, especially of cotton materials. And I dare say that if I was out birding with a shirt that had been fabric softened, I probably would look something like this to the bird. But, which of these reflects reality? We have no idea because we can't know the mind of a bird. Right. We now going to move on to selection pressures that drive color in birds. And I'm going to talk specifically about signaling and about hiding, but I'm going to look at other things as well. And if you look at selection pressures driving color in birds, we can think about natural selection, We can think about what the selection pressure is that we're talking about. We can think about things like signaling and hiding, and we can talk about sexual selection. So those are the topics or the concepts that I'm going to look at quickly. So first of all, natural selection. Again, a review of high school biology for those who may need a little catch up. The natural selection is basically the differential survival of individuals in a population due to differences in features, that is the phenotype. And so a premise of natural selection is that genetically determined variation exists in populations, and some of these variations serve better for survival and or reproduction. So natural selection is all about contributing to the next generation. And the genes that causes the variations increase in the population as a result of their contribution to successful reproduction. And these changes are the basis of evolution by natural selection. So if you look at, imagine a population through time, and some of the variation that may exist in the population, you'll see there's gray, dark gray, and white here. Those that have the red X's are features that are selected against because they don't carry on into the next generation. And those that do carry on into the next generation are selected for. And those are key concepts in evolutionary biology that we need to understand if we're going to understand how color evolves in birds. So selection pressure is basically any factor that changes, either reduces or increases reproductive success in a portion of a population. So if something increases your success and there's a genetic basis for that, that will be an increase in your success. If it reduces your success because that whatever it is interfering in some way with your ability to leave offspring, then that will be a reduction in reproductive success. And so natural selection acts on the phenotype, that is the expression of those genes, and those are the characters that interact with the environment. But genes are responsible for the selected phenotypes then change in frequency in the population as a result of this selection. And genes that reduce reproductive success are selected against, and those that increase reproductive success are selected for. Those are just terms that we use to mean the same thing. Selected against means it interferes with reproductive success, and selected for means it increases reproductive success. And this is the basis of the so-called survival of the fittest, where fitness refers to having genes that increase reproductive success. It doesn't have anything to do with any other kind of fitness. So if we look at selection pressures now, so maybe a selection pressure could be a change of habitat color, for example. And you can see why then it might be that some of those, some of the genetic makeup of these different colored circles would be selected against, and others would be selected for. So let's look at examples of selection pressures driving color evolution in birds. One of them could be holding territory. And it's often associated with bright colors and frequently with red or yellow even. It might be for protecting you against predation. So those would lead to, that selection pressure would lead to cryptic colors. It might be the selection pressure of recognizing your own species. And that could lead to, for example, distinct color patterns evolving, particularly where species evolve in not too distant proximity from one another. And it could be mate choice that acts as a selection pressure, and that could lead to strong sexual color dimorphism. So we'll look at some of these. To understand that, we need to understand animal signals. So animal signals basically are structural or behavioral characteristics that can be used by one animal, which you can consider the sender, to influence the behavior of another, the receiver or the recipient. And so you have a signal, and if you have a signal, then you need to have a receiver. And so you have a sender, a signal, and you have the influence that the sender wants, because there's no want involved. It's purely genetic, to influence how that signal wants to influence the recipient. And then you have the response of the recipient, and you have the long-term consequences of that response, which may impact the fitness, that is the reproductive capability of the receiver. And all animal signaling pretty much works like this. It's a useful metaphor because, of course, that's not really what's going on. There is no intention involved. A typical signal has an intention associated with it. If you're broadcasting a radio signal, there is an intention associated with that. If you're sending out a signal from a lighthouse, there is an intention associated with that. But for animal signals, there is no actual intention, but there is a genetic intention that is selected for by the selection pressures that we've talked about. So it's a metaphor. And it's almost like a gene-to-gene message. It's my genes telling your genes something and causing a consequence. The behavioral influence is immediate, but the long-term consequence is generational. Now, if we think about animal signals, some good examples are songs in birds, calls in birds, color patterns, postural displays. In general, signals provide benefits, often for both the sender and the receiver, but not always, because signals are not always telling the truth. It's a bit like Donald Trump, right? You have an honest signal, or you have a deceptive signal. Okay, guess which one is... No, never mind. I won't talk politics here. So you have an honest signal on the one side, which is reliably conveying useful information to the receiver, like, for example, overall health. And remember, when we're talking about carotenoids, we said that carotenoids also have a antibiotic effect. So if a bird is displaying strong carotenoids, that means that it is healthy, as the theory goes, that it is healthy and it doesn't have to divert carotenoids to getting rid of a bacterial infection, for example. And so it is signaling honestly about its state of health. At the other end is the deceptive signal, which is conveying information that is designed to deceive the receiver. Mimicry is a good example of that. For example, the fork-tailed drongo mimicking the meerkats to be able to steal their food, or mimicry of colors of a toxic organism by one that isn't toxic, to deceive its potential predators into thinking it's toxic and leaving it alone. And then in the middle of this, we have aesthetic signals, which basically convey no useful information beyond attracting the attention of the receiver. It's basically saying, hello, I'm here. And colorful feathers and attractive songs often are of this type. They are aesthetic signals. They are neither honest nor dishonest. They just are what they are. And this has been a long-standing controversy in biology, whether birds' colors are honest signals or aesthetic signals. And on the honest signal side is Alfred Russel Wallace, who was Darwin's co-author on the original natural selection paper, and Darwin himself. And Darwin believed that signals were color signals were typically aesthetic in nature and not honest signals. And Wallace said, no way, that's not possible. And for a long time in Victorian England, this controversy reigned, and it still exists today. But if you think about it, Darwin's focus was on sexual selection by female choice, and the notion that females could make a choice in Victorian England was a very foreign concept. And so there is a little more culture in this controversy than there is science. Right. So sexual selection, defensive territory, distraction, for example, automimicry, and aposematism or warning colors. These are some of the ways in which color signals can be used. So we look at sexual selection. Charles Darwin was the first to really publish about this in his 1871 treatise, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. If you ever get a chance to have a look at this manuscript, it's absolutely fascinating how he understood things, despite the fact of genetics being unknown at the time. So Darwin identified two types of sexual selection: male contests, that is combat and displays, and mate choice. And this is almost always female choice. And the question is it honest signaling or aesthetic signaling? And this is where that cultural view of female humans in Victorian England crept into the science. If you want to understand this a little more, Richard O. Prum has this wonderful book called The Evolution of Beauty, how Darwin's forgotten theory of mate choice shapes the animal world and us. It's well worth a read if you're a birder interested in how birds come to be the way they are. Right, so let's look at sexual selection, and we'll use the southern red bishop. The males are colorful, strongly patterned during the breeding season when they're in their nuptial plumage, and the females are typically more drab, well camouflaged, and similar to non-breeding males. Males take on their breeding plumage during the spring or early summer molt. So what's happening here? So what's happening is you have sexual selection driving the color of the male. Whether you believe it is honest signaling or something else, it is the choice of the female that determines what colors the male has. But the female herself doesn't gain any benefit from diverting carotenoids into feathers. And so natural selection is the primary driver of the color of the female bird. When there is a seasonal breeding behavior and a seasonal molt, the males can go back to being the dirty brown color, that they don't need to divert carotenoids into feathers then, because the females are not interested. They're not going to be making any choices. There is no point in them having their winter plumage to be the same color as their summer plumage or their breeding season plumage. And so that's how a combination of sexual selection and natural selection act together to determine the color patterns that we see in birds. Defensive territory is often cited, but in the 100 and something papers that I read while putting this together, I was not able to find convincing evidence to show that color was actually all that strongly correlated with defensive territories. There were some where it was, and then another paper about the same species that said it showed that it were. The data showed that it wasn't. It was strong in one paper, not strong in another. And I think there is an enormous amount of work still to be done here. But the idea is that color is used to signal competitive ability, And for the signal to be honest, there should be a behavioral counterpart, such as song and aggressiveness, and that is often the case. Greenfinch, for example, in Europe, have a more aggressive behavior that is correlated with the colors that the males produce. But it's very difficult. So the results are ambiguous, and I would say more research is needed. And I'm not going to talk about it anymore because it's a waste of time at this stage. Now, if we think about another example, this is the pearl-spotted owlet, which we all know very well in southern Africa. And it is a beautiful bird. It looks like this when it's looking at you. It's got these two beautiful yellowy green eyes. And then it turns its head around, and it's got fake eyes at the back of its head, called ocelli. And in fact, if you look at the back of this owl's head, it almost looks like a face. It's more than just the eyes that are being mimicked here. And this pattern, which is, of course, it's brown, it's mostly melanin, but it is a color pattern that is designed or that evolved for distraction. And at some point, if I ever get around to publishing it, I actually have a little blog post to make on this, where I look at how this face on the back of the head could have evolved. But that's beyond the scope of this talk because I'm almost out of time already. There's another one that is a little bit strange. It's warning colors. And I found this paper that recently looked at aposematism and mimicry in birds, and they came up with a list of birds, some of which go back to this 1902 paper by Marshall, that looks at whether the birds are palatable and whether there's any signaling involved or any colors associated with that. And his paper, the Marshall 1902 one, suggests that in the ground hornbill, the red face and the white feathers are actually signaling the fact that they don't taste very good, and so helping predators decide not to eat them. I am unsure about that, and this review by Headley and Caro doesn't come to any conclusion. It just provides a review of what was published already. But it's an interesting concept, and I wonder if there are birds that are actually signaling on palatability. And of course, hiding, blending in with the environment, camouflage, and counter shading. So camouflage basically is a defense mechanism where the organism's color patterns help them blend in with their surroundings, and counter shading is also similar, but it has to do with the animal being darker on top and lighter on the underside, counterbalancing the effects of shadowing, making the bird more difficult to see by predators or prey. And I found this paper, and I thought this really interesting. It's coming out of Claire Spottiswood's lab, of course, which all the really creative and interesting things are coming out of these days, or a lot of creative and interesting things are coming out of these days. They found that individual birds that rely on camouflage can choose the best place to conceal themselves based on their individual appearance. And choice of where to nest is based on the specific patterns and colors of the eggs, in the case of plovers and coursers, that when they're disturbed, they run away a long distance. So the eggs need to be better camouflage so that predator or whoever's disturbing them won't find the eggs. On the other hand, if the bird sits tight on their eggs when disturbed, then it's more important that the plumage of the bird is blending in with the environment. And what they discovered is that the animal chooses an environment that matches either their own feather color patterns or the eggs color patterns, depending on which of these two behavioral strategies they adopt, which is, it just goes to show how nuanced it is to understand the life of a bird and what's going on there and what are the evolutionary implications of something as simple as color. And so what this also showed is that behaviors have to co-evolve with camouflage for the camouflage to be effective, and that the behaviors can be absolutely subtle and not obvious to a casual human observer. And then, of course, there's counter shading, which is a selection pressure, which evolved because of a selection pressure to stay hidden, but in a different context, and that is in flight. And so a lot of birds will be dark on the back and light on the belly, so that when you're looking up at them, the light color makes them blend in better with the sky. And when you're looking down, the dark color makes them blend in better with the ground. And so there is a color pattern that that relates to hiding called counter shading. Right, so I've gone about 4 minutes over, so I'm going to finish up. I've tried to present a way of making birding more interesting through knowledge, and how we can look at what we see when we're out watching birds, and try to understand how those things came to be the way they are. We've looked at color, which is the brain's interpretation of a arbitrary segment of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. And we've looked at how chemistry and physics are used to make color in birds. We've looked at the biology of how birds see color through their tetrachromatic vision. And of course, we have no idea what they actually see. And we've had a look at the primary selection pressures driving color evolution in birds. And I think that's my story for the day. And I want to thank you. And if you're new to Learn the Birds, please do come visit us, visit our YouTube channel. And you can also find me, Derek at learnthebirds.com. You can find my photos on flickr.com/photos_dkeats. And we have a children's book project that my wife and I are doing. The one that we've just printed in South Africa is called There's a Dinosaur in My Tree. And it is available from our kengapub.com website, or at least it will be by Sunday, as soon as I figure out how to get the shipping plugin to work. And it's basically a book that shows some of these evolutionary things that we are interested in, and talks about how the birds that we see today are in fact theropod dinosaurs, and how that came to be. And thank you very much. So I will stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Derek. I don't know if you can hear me now. Just folks could maybe feel free to ask Derek questions. I think just pop them in the message box. I think Lawrence has asked some questions early on. If I could just highlight those. He's asking about, could color also be related to heating or cooling, depending on environmental locations? I'm not quite sure that I understand the question, but yeah.
I could imagine that it would be like, for example, a dark bird in a hot tropical climate with lots of sunshine would probably, you would imagine it would be warm for it. And birds obviously have an upper temperature beyond which it's lethal to them, right? So if anything that is going to raise their temperature would be selected against if it's going to push them up to temperatures that are close to that upper limit which they can survive. Yeah. But beyond that, I really don't know. I've not seen anything that has come out of the folks working on the Hot Bird project that has suggested that there's any evolutionary response to upper temp, to global warming or anything like that. So yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen a paper that covers that topic.
Yeah, fascinating. Any further questions? I think it's been absolutely wonderful presentation, Derek, and you've obviously done, sounds like a lot of research. But I just wanted to ask something that I've always been fascinated with is the integration of color tracts, so parts of the plumage which are hidden, but then revealed in association with certain displays. So you see the pictorial patches on some of our southern African sunbirds.
Yeah.
You've got patches on the backs of honey guides that they use in displays, that the crest of the red-crested Quran. So those are right across the world, and they're very, very specific, almost to specific behaviors. I would just think they lend a lot of clues as to how these colors are used and how the females and other birds would respond to those.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about evolution is that, it's a entirely there's no thinking involved in it, right? There's no knowledge involved in it. It's a thing that happens. A female, I'll take the Koran as an example. A red-crested Koran. The female decides that, hey, there's a guy with a few red feathers on the back of his neck. I like that, and that's the extent of it. But by liking it, she allows that male to mate, and they create more offspring. And in the process, those offspring are the gene increases in the population. And because the females are also influenced by their own genetics, that means that their genetic predisposition to favor red crest also increases in the population. And so through a few generations, you can have the mathematician Fisher called it a runaway evolution, where something that has no benefit beyond a female's aesthetic choice takes off in the population very quickly, and it becomes the dominant feature. And interestingly, also, if you're looking at it from an island biogeography perspective, where that happens in isolated habitats, you often get obviously it was there in an ancestral population that got separated and then evolved differently in the different in the different islands. And islands don't necessarily have to be islands in the sea; they can be isolated mountains or mountain. The Cape Mountain Range, for example, is a good example of where mountains become islands, and so you have different fynbos species evolving in those isolated areas. But the same thing happens to birds and insects and mammals and other things. So it's quite fascinating. I mean, that example that I showed you of the pheasant, the Argus pheasant. I mean, look at those patterns. I mean, you would never imagine that something like that could evolve, but that it could evolve by female choice is amazing.
Lawrence asked a question, and I think he's keen to hear an answer. I think it's to do with the science, and that was how did we determine? So how do we know what spectrum other species perceive? How do we know the ultraviolet that birds can see that part of the spectrum? I think it's a question about the scientific methodology.
So that's a good question, and I have to admit that I don't know the full answer, but I can speculate based on my knowledge of biology, and that is that you've got those four cones, right? And those four cones are sensitive to different different light spectra, and we can determine that because we can take something that reflects that light, or we can shine that light of that color at those eyes and see if there is a response. And so in doing that, we know that for example, if you took ultraviolet light and shined it into my eyes, I wouldn't see anything, although my eyes might get sunburned. But I wouldn't see anything. But if you shine it into a bird's eye, you're going to produce a result.
A reaction of some sort, even if it's some nervous system reaction which you could detect in the laboratory.
Yes. So,
Yeah.
you know, there's different ways to do it. And what now we have, again, Claire Spottiswoode Lab, I think, is one of the pioneers in that area, is being able to look at color patterns and map them onto what is known about the way birds see and produce a kind of color map, which shows what a bird would see, but it doesn't show how a bird would see it, because we don't know how a bird would see it, right? Because it's none of the colors that none of the things that we call colors have any existence outside of our brain. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely fascinating talk. Well done, Derek. That's fantastic. So thanks very much to everyone for coming along and joining us. Just to save the date, 19th of September, I think it is. Hong Kong, we're going to have Oscar Chun Fai, who's a birder in that area, talking about birding in Hong Kong. I'm sure that's going to be really, really interesting for birders. And thank you very much, Derek, for a fascinating. It sounds to me like, if I can just make a final remark, that this is more than one webinar. It's going, there's a lot more to it than what you've presented.
There is, and I see that someone asked about the color in birds' eyes, and I didn't touch on that at all. I didn't. And it's a really interesting topic, why birds have the eye colors that they have. Ask me again in a few months when I've read a few more papers.
Yeah.
But there actually isn't, surprisingly, there isn't much published on eye colors in birds.
Okay, fascinating. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and all the best. Have a good evening, and we'll see you at the next webinar on Learn the Birds. Thanks.